Okay, we're back with Kant. So what was the whole point of the mathematics and geometry thing and the pure intuitions? Well, the point Kant was trying to get across with all that was to sort of set up a metaphysical picture. That's the way I like to put it, a picture of how metaphysics works in the world. He calls his philosophy transcendental idealism and empirical realism. This is going to take a bit of explanation. There's a lot of technical terms here, and it can be very confusing until you work out what all these technical terms mean and how this is supposed to go. But don't be too intimidated, please. It's not that, it really actually is not that hard to understand. It's just working your way around all of the terminology to try to figure out what he's actually trying to say. All right, so let's try to get into this. Let's start with things in themselves. Okay, so Kant has this notion of things in themselves. He also calls it noumena, same thing. To make matters worse, he actually has more than one term for things. But yeah, okay, so the same thing, noumena or things in themselves. This is the world, all around us, all the things that exist in the world around us. That's things in themselves. Now, these things in themselves impact, come into contact with. The reason I'm being a little cautious here because, as I'll note this in a minute, we don't actually know how this happens, but somehow or other, all the things in themselves collide with our consciousness. Kant uses the term consciousness in general because, not because he thinks we all have our individual consciousness. We're not like one, we're not like the Borg with one general consciousness. Sorry for that reference. We have our individual consciousness, which he calls the transcendental unity of apperception. Instead of just calling it your individual consciousness, he has to make a big term out of it. But what he's really interested in is the things that our consciousness collectively, like for all of us, the things that we all do the same, okay? We all perceive the world in different ways. He doesn't dismiss that, but that's not his interest. Why do we all do the same? Okay, how do we all understand the world, experience the world the same, collectively? He uses the term rational beings, actually, not even human beings. But so for human beings in general, I'm going to stick with human beings, how do we experience the world the same way? And this is where you find the conditions for the possibility of experience, or he also uses the term requirements for the possibility of experience or requirements for experience. And this is where you find the pure intuitions that we just talked about. So we all experience the world in space and time. These are requirements, they're conditions, and they're built into our consciousness. So we all so we share these. So we're all living in the same space and time. No matter who you are, you're in the same space and time. And so that's the first thing that he notes under the conditions of the possibility of experience. Okay, so then once the things in themselves, whatever it is out there, collides with our consciousness, comes into contact with our consciousness, we compute, using a very modern term here, we organize, arrange those experiences in a certain way. that all human beings do this in the same way. Well, in certain ways, the same. Maybe I should put it that way instead. And the result of that is our empirical world. That is the world of our experience. Empirical means experience. By the way, those terms, transcendental and empirical, those actually he did not make up. They're technical terms, but they're general philosophical terms. And transcendental means outside of experience, and empirical means within experience. Anyway, so once we receive the whatever information from things in themselves, and it goes through our consciousness, and we arrange it and organize it, and what, you know, our consciousness is doing this. It's not like we're intentionally doing this. Our consciousness just does this. Then we get our representations, our appearances. Representations is kind of like what Hume or Descartes would call ideas. Maybe appearances, there's a little overlap there. Appearances, I'm lumping this all together. For Kant, appearances are a bit more subjective than representations, but I'm just going to put it all together. It's complicated enough without making these distinctions. He also calls this nature. That is the world we experience as nature. I would just say the human world, the way that human beings experience the world. That is the empirical world that we experience. Now, what is this veil of representation thing? Well, this actually is not one of Kant, as if there wasn't enough terminology already, but this is what everybody else calls Kant's, or refers to this when they're talking about Kant's philosophy. They refer to the veil of representation. This separates the knowable, I got to be careful here, knowable from the unknowable. The reason I'm trying to be careful here is because it's not the known from the unknown. Don't confuse that, okay? It is knowable and unknowable. So in the transcendental realm here with things in themselves, and by the way, consciousness is in there, these things are unknowable. In other words, impossible to know. You can't, there's no way, no way, no how. We're never, ever going to be able to know what's going on that side of the veil of representation. That is the consciousness and things in themselves side. On the empirical side, in terms of our experience, everything is knowable. Again, not known. We're always learning things, and we can learn things, and but it's knowable. It is perfectly possible to actually learn and know things. All right, the reason there's a veil of representation here is because this is an input-output model, and I think that's the easiest way to think about this. In other words, it only goes in one direction. There's the things in themselves, they're inputted into the consciousness, well, I guess, into your consciousness, pointing at my head like it's my consciousness. But anyways, they're inputted into your consciousness, and your consciousness outputs your experiences, okay? So the output is your experience, and that's what you experience. So you know that, but it can never go backwards. This is the thing. You can't go from your experience back into your consciousness, back into things in themselves. Well, actually, let me restate that a little first before I explain this. You can never go from your experience back to things in themselves. That's definitely true. Okay, so you cannot, from your experience, you cannot draw any conclusions or know anything at all about things in themselves or noumena. So it's just completely unknown. This, by the way, bothers a lot of people, that Kant is pretty much saying there's a whole bunch of the world, there, you know, There's a whole bunch of reality that we're never going to know. We can never know. Can never know. Not just we don't know. We'll never know it. It's impossible. Okay. Now, here's the caveat and a little, okay, just consciousness in general. All right, so we cannot experience our own consciousness. We experience what comes out of our consciousness. That is, we experience the thoughts, ideas, and whatever, but we don't know where that comes from. This is the point. This point precedes Kant way back to Descartes. People said you can't experience your own consciousness. You can only experience what comes out of your consciousness. All right, or your mind. You can say mind. That's the term that you would find in Kant, or sorry, you'd find in Descartes. What Kant wants to say, though, is that one thing that we can know, and it's the only thing that we can know about the noumenal realm, the things in themselves, or the transcendental realm. There's one thing that we can kind of figure out, and it's only because of what happens in our experiences we can go back and try to figure out what must be going on in our own consciousness. In other words, how are we arranging the world, sorting through our experiences and organizing our experiences into something coherent that we can't, in a way that we can't experience that? So that's what the conditions for the possibility of experience means, or the requirements. What had to have happened in our consciousness to make experience possible? Okay, so I'm tempted to use the 25 people in the room thing that the other video I showed you. That was a good analogy, but I'll just let you watch that and think about it. So set that aside. So what are the conditions for the possibility experience? Okay, well, here's one for sure. It is impossible. You cannot possibly have an experience if it didn't happen at some space, at some time, so somewhere and some when. It's impossible. Every experience you have has to have happened somewhere and at some time. So apparently, Kant reasons, that is the condition for the possibility of experience. That is one way that we organize, arrange, compute our experiences from things in themselves. Notice that he has space and time built into our consciousness. Is space and time an objective fact about the universe? Is the universe really have space and time? We don't know. Kant doesn't say no. He just says, because it's in that realm of where we don't know. You know, it's in the noumena, things in themselves side of the equation. And therefore, we do not know whether space and time exist outside of us, but we know one thing: it exists in our minds as an organizing principle for our experiences. And therefore, every experience we have has to take place at some space and time. It's a requirement. That's what he means by a requirement. All right, so there's this whole unknowable world out there. That's the things in themselves. I don't want to say, it's kind of wrong to say world. It's the same world. It's just part of the world we don't know is things in themselves. The part of the world we do know is our experiences, which we collectively share, by the way. It's not my experience or your experience. That's the whole point of the consciousness in general thing. It's not like everybody lives in their own separate world. If you're a human being, consciousness in general, you experience the world this way, namely in space and time. That's one of the things that we all share together. Again, he's not saying we share everything, like everybody smells the same or tastes the same or whatever. But in these particular ways, we all experience the world the same way. All right, is this making any, I hope this is making some sense. All right, think of it as an input-output model. Like I said, things in themselves input information into your consciousness. Your consciousness gives an output of experience, and it only goes one direction. You can't go backwards. Okay, so all we know is our experiences. We assume that there are things in themselves and the consciousness that are doing this prior to our experience. This is Kant's way of understanding the metaphysical situation that we are in. All right, now before I wrap this up, I want to go back to that crazy paragraph I read that sounded like it was nonsense, but hopefully it won't be such nonsense now. All right, so this is not a precise quote, but it is very close to what Kant wrote. He says, math contains synthetic a priori judgments. Okay, we talked about that last time. Where do these come from? The answer is they are exhibited a priori in pure intuition. All right, and I talked about why he thinks that. This is not empirical intuition or sense perception, but pure intuition apart from and prior to objects. Prior to objects. In other words, the pure intuition happens before you experience objects. That's what yeah, before you experience representations, appearances, objects, the pure intuition happens before that in this input-output model. So, pure intuition makes the representation of objects possible. That's because it is how we couldn't experience something if we didn't arrange things into space and time. So it is a requirement, right? What it says there. Okay. Our intuition does not represent things in themselves, but only how things appear to us. All right. Now this may be making a little more sense, I hope. So we have a veil of representation. Pure intuition is the form of our sensibility and lends form to our representation of objects. Again, that is how we arrange our experiences, or that is how we arrange the information going into our consciousness and which enables us to experience things. Since we know objects only as they appear, we can understand the requirements for their appearing to us. So this is kind of the claim he's making. We can look at how we experience the world, and then we can see on the other side of the veil what is going on in our own consciousness by deducing it from what we do actually experience. We can figure out what happened in our consciousness to make it possible for us to experience these things. These requirements include space and time, the pure intuitions. You can't have an experience without it being in space and time. And these are the pure intuitions. Clearly, all experience needs these, hence they are the a priori form of appearances. By the way, they are a priori, because this is not, this is literally prior to experiences. It's not based upon experience that this is happening. This is how our mind is arranging experience. So it's a priori requirements for experience. All right. Hey, simple, right? Actually, I just want to, express a little personal thought opinion on this. This sounds very ponderous and difficult, but actually I think it's really not that hard. Think input output model. There's things out in the world, they come into contact with your consciousness arranges it, computes it, boom, you get experiences. It only goes one direction. The terminology is what trips people up so much, but if you can kind of get past that a little bit, you'll see this is not that, this is really not that complicated. Hume, I think, is much more complicated, much more subtle. This is pretty straightforward. You just have to, like I said, through the terminology. All right, so now I'm not done with Kant yet, because the original question was, how is metaphysics possible? And we have not answered that question yet. even with all of this, we have not really, because it was how, I'm not going to change the screen right now, just I will for the next lecture, but how is metaphysics possible is how are synthetic a priori judgments possible? And we got math and geometry, but that's not metaphysics. He stipulated that at the beginning. He said that's he's excluding that, so that's not going to be the answer. So we haven't found any synthetic a priori judgments to confirm that metaphysics is possible. And therefore, there's another step, and there's also consequences. Yeah, what does all this lead up to, or what are the results of all this philosophizing? Yeah, we need to talk about that. So we'll get to that in the next lecture. Thank you.